The party treks through the crystal caves of Montaharo, filled to the brim with the spawn of aberrations from the far realms. They find themselves eventually at a clearing. A tidal wave of star hatchlings climb up, rushing toward them. You expect this to be a difficult encounter. Everyone rolls initiative. The hatchlings go first and swarm at both your cleric and wizard. With the wizard's shield spell and the cleric's armor, they're able to stay standing. The rogue slashes through one of the many hatchlings, and then it's your wizard's go. They cast Circle of Death on the waves of hatchlings, clearing through half of them. Your cleric goes after, calling upon divine light to incinerate the rest with the sunbeam. It wasn't unfun, but it certainly wasn't as gripping as you thought it'd be. Let's talk about it. For the past couple of adventures, maybe you've been DMing and running some pretty terrible fights. Maybe an enemy you've been hyping up died in 2 rounds, or a band of goblins somehow wiped your whole party. You look online for a solution. Some guides tell you to choose an appropriate CR. Okay, you start throwing hard encounters, then deadly encounters, then double, triple, quadruple deadly, and you don't even understand what the point of this CR even is. Heck, even your quintuple deadly encounters might get curb stomped by a lucky hypnotic pattern or something. Even if you do find success with challenge rating, it doesn't give you the skills you need to make balanced monsters by yourself, or teach you how to modify an existing monster to create an evocative fantasy. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to use fundamental concepts of the game to make the encounters you've always wanted to make. I'm going to talk about the secret underlying design framework of combat creation, and provide a free tool to help you design those encounters. If you stick through this video, you're going to get GMing advice that nobody else on the planet will give you. This is why your monsters suck. This episode we're focused on concepts. First, we have to discuss what difficulty means. One of the many problems with CR is that they attach misleading names to different tiers of difficulty for encounters. To most people, when they see the term deadly encounter, they believe the players have a decent chance of losing the encounter and getting wiped. This is not the case. The designers created the deadly difficulty with the intention that if something goes horribly wrong, there's a chance that a single party member could die. So, when we design our combats and our campaigns, we should ask ourselves, how likely is it that my party will fail? If you want to create a grim, dark, tough campaign, then the base difficulty of every fight should be much higher. I want you to keep this in mind though. The more likely it is your party can fail, the more frustrating it may be. Modern tabletop culture is not geared around characters dying constantly. That was common decades ago. People nowadays get really invested in their characters. If you want high chances of death or failure in your game, let your players know that before they make their characters and backups. Difficult games also have less room for error. Even if you're running a gritty Souls-like campaign, those games take a lot of care in making sure it feels as fair as possible. When you design these mathematically difficult combats, you need to make sure it feels fair, which requires a lot of telegraphing and game design finesse. You can check out one of my previous videos in this series for some insight on that. If you're running more of a Dynasty Warrior style power fest, then you need to take care in making sure the players feel powerful rather than feeling mindless. That's also a fine balance to teeter when there's an exceedingly low chance of failure. Usually, most tables will enjoy something in between. A somewhat unlikely chance of failure, 5 to 10% I'd say, but a possible one. The difficulty of your game can impact the tone heavily, so do what best fits your table. When balancing your encounters, there are many hidden things that can throw your desired difficulty off the rails. There are certain player traits or features that can disrupt the intended difficulty quite drastically. These features are disruptive because they affect the action economy too much. Much of the difficulty and strength of features in a turn-based RPG system is based on the action economy. Action economy is simply how much value a character gets within their turn. The more efficient your action economy, the more value you're getting. In a game like League of Legends, one member of either team getting picked off is pretty bad, especially at higher skill levels. A 2 to 3 man deficit? It might as well be impossible at pro-level play. The same principle applies to turn-based games. Having more or less actions is extremely important. If you have less actions, each action needs to be stronger to compensate. The traits that disrupt intended difficulty are those with extremely disproportionate action economy trade-off. Hypnotic Pattern is a low resource spell both in terms of spell slots and its actions. It only requires 1. It usually takes several creatures out of the fight entirely regardless of their health. Basically, one action in exchange to negate several actions for multiple turns. Thus, Hypnotic Pattern has an insane action economy efficiency. Other mass crowd control spells like Web also have insane action economy efficiency. Against a single boss, single target crowd control like Heat Metal or Hold Person can be devastating as they have high value against that one creature across multiple turns. We will be calling features with incredibly disproportionate action economy efficiency force multipliers. Strong crowd controls and obscene damage per round synergies are generally amazing force multipliers. Anything that lets you hit well above your weight class. Essentially, cheese. The rest of the video and the tool I've made assume that you have kept force multipliers in check. My first video in the Why Your Monsters Suck series, Defense, discusses how to handle force multipliers, especially with boss monsters. Having more creatures, thus more actions in the action economy, can also be an adequate way to deal with force multipliers. Party composition and the level of play can also affect the desired level of difficulty. The full caster classes, like the Wizards, Clerics, and Druids, scale exponentially in power every level compared to the non-caster classes like Fighters, Rogues, and Barbarians. They scale more linearly. If the composition of full casters and full non-casters were pitted against the same monster, the full casters would have an easier time at most tiers of play. The party's items and other boons that you can grant can also sway the game balance. Obviously, having a Flame Tongue and +3 armor at level 3 would impact game balance severely. Terrain and other outside variables like allies or special area conditions should also be accounted for. For example, if there's falling damage and elevated terrain that you expect your players to exploit, maybe add some health to your creature to account for that fact, and incentivize them to knock them off to make the fight progress faster. The inverse is true as well. If you're running a flying creature facing a mostly melee party in open air, decrease their health to make the fight less of a potential slog. So, now that we've determined our desired difficulty and accounted for disruptive factors, we can make the assumptions for our monster creation system. Number 1, we have chosen a desired difficulty. Number 2, we have negated or weakened the impact of party force multipliers. Number 3, we have accounted for party composition. Number 4, we have accounted for party inventory/magical items. And number 5, we have accounted for terrain and outside factors so they do not act as force multipliers. If these assumptions are not followed, then the rest of the system will not work. With these assumptions set, these are the components of the monster. Defense: AC, health, and number of monsters. Offense: accuracy, damage, number of turns, number of monsters, number of attacks, and number of AoEs. These are the same variables used in my tool, the Heroic Homebrew Monster Maker. If you want to follow along and tinker with it, make a copy of the spreadsheet in the description below. Fundamentally, there are 3 steps to making a mathematically balanced homebrew creature. Number 1, input party statistics. Number 2, determine difficulty and power budget. And number 3, output desired monster traits. We're at the first step, input party statistics. The monster's final stats in the Monster Maker are based on the party statistics. The player's to hit bonus helps to determine the monster's armor class. If the character does not attack often, do not fill in this column. Wizards are not allowed in this treehouse. If your party uses Bless often or something that gives additional bonuses to hit across the party, factor that in. Infrequent accuracy boosters like Bardic Inspiration should not be considered. Bless adds around 2 to your chance to hit for reference. It's way more complicated than that in reality, but that's a good estimate. Armor class in one part determines the monster's to hit bonus. If the character has the shield spell, especially at higher levels, add the spell's AC bonus. Just do it. Every wizard spams it. Effective health of the players determines the health of the monster and the damage of the monster. The player has significant amounts of healing or temporary hit points in this encounter. Account for that by adding those things. This creates a player's effective health. I would not account for things like healing word at lower levels, but bigger, fatter heals like heal or mass heal are definitely worth considering. Lower level healing spells are used to keep action economy high, not entirely for their survivability. Since we're using effective health of the players to calculate the health of the monster, That assumes the players deal about as much damage as they can take. This assumption is false if you have a decently optimized party or one that deals an irregular amount of damage. Here's a baseline. If a significant amount of the party is beating this baseline consistently, that probably means the effective health assumption is false. When this assumption is false, we have to use the damage per round of the players instead. This is much more precise than the effective health formula, but requires some work. If you want to keep using the rough estimate of effective health, or the assumption still applies to your party, skip to this timestamp. Alright, click the box below DPR or damage per round. Think about your individual party members and whether they attack more or use saving throws more. Then, we're going to calculate the DPR of one of the party members. They're a fighter that attacks a bunch. To calculate this, we're going to the Advanced Attack DPR section. Full disclosure, these DPR sheets were made by Aureus Fulgen and Ludic Savant. I have a link to their original sheets in the description. So, let's break everything down here. We don't have to worry about target AC or your characters to hit bonus. Keep those the same. We're not considering accuracy at this step. We're going to manually input accuracy at a later step to get the game feel we want. Put in your fighter's damage dice for their weapon and their bonus to damage. Then change the number of attacks to the number of attacks they have. Our fighter is level 20, so they have 4 attacks. If they have a weapon like a flame tongue that provides bonus damage dice on every single hit, add that to this row as well. If they have a bonus action attack from something like Crossbow Expert or Polearm Master, change the number of bonus action attacks from 0 to 1 and repeat the process for those attacks. When we're calculating the DPR, we're doing a midpoint of their resourceless damage and their Nova damage if they spend everything. A good rule of thumb is that if they can spend the resource for extra damage for about 3 to 4 rounds, it's a good midpoint. Since our fighter is a Battle Master, they can spend maneuver dice fairly often, so I'll add his maneuver dice to the bonus damage on first hit. Another example of how to input medium resource DPR is the Paladin. If your Paladin spends slots on smites often, add the smite damage dice of an average level to the bonus on first hit category. Say if they have access to 4th level slots, add the damage dice of a 2nd level smite there. Round up if it's odd. My recommendations are just a rule of thumb if you have no idea where to go. If you know how the party spends their resources, make those your assumptions instead. If the character primarily uses summons, input the damage dice of an individual summon's attack. The number of attacks should now be equal to the number of attacks each summon can make, multiplied by the number of summons. Some subclasses like Shepherd Druid increase the damage of summons, so take that into account. Once you have the numbers for the party members that deal damage through attacks, record their normal DPR in the red box, and write it in the DPR box for player inputs. Our fighter's DPR is 52. For characters that rely on saving throws, consider what their most commonly used spell is that deals damage. Input the damage dice for that spell or effect, then go to the save type and select the save type that is appropriate. We're using Fireball for our wizard. It's their bread and butter. It's a save for half spell that deals 8d6 damage. Don't mess with the number of targets section, keep it at 1. Record the number in the red DPR box, and write it in the player input row. If you make an encounter with hordes of enemies, their DPR will be much higher than if they were against just a few enemies. Don't change the end DPR based on the number of enemies. Consider the battlefield terrain and the positioning of the enemies and adjust accordingly. Adjust expectations based on how you know your group will play. The midpoint guideline is just a guideline. If you know your paladin or cleric uses everything every fight, adjust your assumptions and calculations based on that. After you input all characters that mainly use saving throws, we're done with the DPR, and now we have an accurate guideline for your custom monster's health. The save bonuses of the party help determine the save DCs of the monster. If the party has consistent saving throw protections like Aura of Protection, factor that in if it will be relevant to the fight. Now, there's the magic item difficulty scaler. Only mess with this if you're giving out significant magic items. Be more conservative in your estimates when adjusting this. If there are allies in this fight, add them to the sheet. This is simple enough. Let's move on to the fun part, building the monster's stats. On this second sheet, you'll see a difficulty slider. You can set either a custom difficulty or one of the presets. The desired difficulty is based on the amount of rounds it takes for the party to win, and the amount of rounds it takes for the monster to win. The more rounds it takes for the party to win, the more health the monster has. The less rounds it takes for the monster to win, the more damage the monster deals. By basing difficulty off of rounds, we can control the pacing of the fight itself. The presets are designed to be accurate to their names. However, they will be only accurate if you play them as best as you can. If the creature has behaviors that would significantly alter their effectiveness, consider adjusting the difficulty to account for that. Curb Stomp difficulty is actually a curb stomp. It mathematically would take an average party around 1 round to smoke this group of monsters. It would take these monsters 8 rounds to defeat this party. It's never happening. On easy difficulty, the health is ramping up a bit to last a smidge longer, but their offense isn't enough to pose a real threat. On medium, the monsters get another boost. Lasting for 3 rounds is a significant milestone at this point, so they have far more chance of actually dealing some damage. On challenging, somebody has a real chance of going down in this fight. If the fight really goes terribly, maybe somebody could die. This is sort of equivalent to deadly in the CR system. On coin flip difficulty, the monster is functionally equivalent to the party. It is actually a coin flip if the players win, and there are no cheesy force multipliers or outside variables involved. At this point in Past It, we are getting into dangerous territory balance-wise. On the difficulties past Monster Advantage tier, I would recommend letting the players know what they're getting into because the chance that they lose gets much higher. The damage averages get so high that the monster can both drop a party member to 0 and deal high amounts of damage to other party members. The party will start consistently losing action economy against these monsters, which decreases their offensive output. These high difficulty encounters can really snowball against the party. If you want a serious fight at either statistical end, you could have experimental mechanics that give one side a disproportionate advantage. Essentially, the encounter should be designed with a built-in force multiplier if you want encounters at statistical extremes. Maybe your extremely overpowered giant has a crippling weakness to lightning that the players figured out from a knowledge check. You placed a magic bow in combat that deals a tremendous amount of lightning damage, and your players are able to beat the giant with it. Conversely, the enemies are so tiny that the players cannot physically hit them with most abilities. Maybe they have to eat some shrooms to get tiny in order to fight them adequately. The monsters may deal middling damage in order to let the players figure out the mechanic. We can use a combination of difficulties throughout encounters or campaigns to create the tone we desire. A difficulty curve, if you will. Here's an example for a broader campaign. In a gritty, difficult campaign, we would maybe have the baseline be around medium to challenging, and have the harder climactic fights be around the large monster advantage difficulty. Here's an example for a story arc within a campaign. Immediately after the party levels, let's start the curve with a few curb stomp encounters. We're going to let the party feel strong by having them smack the life out of some goons after they level, and let them experiment with their new features. After that, we might conclude the arc with a few mediums after they familiarize themselves with their abilities. You could also use the custom value setting to fine-tune and create encounters of your own devious design. You could have an encounter where both the party and the creature blow up in one turn by setting both player win and monster wins to be 1 round. Maybe it could be a slower battle, so you set both numbers to 10. You can also use decimals to fine-tune the experience you want. After we determine the numerical difficulty, we should determine the first monster group's name. A monster group is a single monster or group of monsters with identical stats. Then we assign the accuracy of the monster. Input the accuracy you want the monster to have, and the sheet will provide a to-hit bonus for your custom monster. The sweet spot area I'd say is around 50 to 75% for most monsters. Once you start deviating from that, the damage starts getting wonky, since the lower the accuracy, the greater the damage per attack has to be to compensate. Ranges outside the sweet spot can be used to cultivate a certain flavor. Accuracies that approach 100% may portray a primordial certain force like death, or maybe it's some sort of dead shot like a cowboy. Ranges below 50% can portray a very powerful yet imprecise creature like a giant. Just keep in mind that you should play monsters outside of the sweet spot accuracies a bit differently than normal creatures. After accuracy, determine how many attacks they should have. More attacks necessitate lower damage to keep the damage the same, but it's less swingy. Attacks in 5e usually scale with the tiers of play, but you can buck this trend. Lots of attacks may be indicative of an insanely feral beast or a master swordsman. 1 to 2 attacks, especially at higher tiers of play, may again portray a physically mighty creature. Then we input our player's accuracy. Sweet spots are around the same here. As a point of advice, low accuracy can be frustrating, while high accuracy can be super fun if they want to unload damage. Lower accuracy means lower health, and higher accuracy means greater monster health. The ranges outside of the sweet spots still portray different flavors. The low end could maybe beat some indestructible construct, while the high end may be a massive, easy-to-hit sludge monster. Now, we're onto the juicy stuff. The power budget section is one of the most influential and useful parts of the entire monster maker. You can use it to plan out an encounter day, or use it to distribute power between creatures during an encounter. You determine the length of the adventuring period and what encounters are in it. For every rest you give the party during the adventuring period, give yourself 100% to play with. Every 100% is the budget for one rest period. If you let them rest before they complete 100% of the power budget, the encounters will be unbalanced. Before you assign your budget, think ahead of time about these things. How many rest periods should I give them? How many individual encounters will there be in the adventuring period? How many monster groups will there be? How many monsters are in each monster group? I'm going to have 3 rest periods, so that gives me 300% to work with. I'm spending 100% on a boss fight up first, another 100% on a group of 5, then the party fights the last 100% of 3 monster groups. I could make them take on the last 3 monster groups in individual encounters, which would be easier, or take all 3 of them on simultaneously, which would be harder. This would be better for a common, more narrative-based game with cinematic encounters. I could instead have the budget be 1 rest period at the very end, giving me just 100% to work with. I give every encounter 20% to work with, and then can group them into any number of separate individual encounters. This is similar to the regular adventuring day for more classic dungeon crawl style games. The power budget can also let you make statistical trade-offs depending on the special traits or characteristics of the creature. Say a caster creature and a defender creature were a pair fighting the party. It wouldn't make sense for the caster creature to have the same defensive capacity as the defender creature. Maybe the caster creature has 75% of the offensive budget and 25% of the defensive budget, while the defender has 75% of the defensive budget and 25% of the offensive budget. Consider the trade-offs and roles that your monsters are playing when assigning the budget. If you want a monster group or encounter to have a high quantity of monsters at higher tiers of play, give the minions a very low defensive budget, 1 to 10%, increase the number of them drastically, and spread them throughout the battlefield with decent positioning. This should mitigate the impact of force multiplying AoE abilities, which are common at that tier of play. The number of initiatives should only be different from the number of monsters in the case of elite or boss creatures. While it isn't conventional in 5e design, many turn-based RPGs give their bosses multiple turns to compete with the party's action economy. Giving your bosses multiple turns can be a good way to reduce their damage per attack and give them more movement and reactions to play with. Obviously, you should design monsters around their multiple turns if they have them. If you want to implement legendary actions alongside multiple turns, consider making the legendary actions replenish at the start of its highest initiative turn. The last section before we move on to the final monster stats are areas of effect. Not all monsters need one, but it's certainly a consideration for many monsters, and can be a good way to make your monsters stronger. The type of saving throw you force can evoke very different types of flavor. Strength saves are often used to avoid getting restrained or forcefully moved, typically forced by very strong beasts or mighty warriors. Dexterity saves are quite common and used to move out of the way of explosions or traps. Constitution saves are often for bracing through physically taxing things on your body like exhaustion or poisons. Intelligence saves are often the rarest and most devastating, things that target the mind specifically like mind flayers or spells like Psychic Scream. Wisdom saves are things like fears and frightens, things that make you go against your better judgment. Charisma saves are almost exclusively to do with things involving sheer willpower. Good examples of this are staying glued to your plan a la banishment, or staving off possession from ghosts. Consider amplifying or reducing the damage from the calculator's given value, depending on the condition or effect your chosen saving throw applies. If it afflicts a nasty condition, consider decreasing the damage. How the damage of the spell is afflicted also grants a different flavor. A Save or Take Half ability makes sense if it's hard to avoid in the fiction entirely, like the explosion of a fireball. A Save or Take None ability should be more horrifying to get hit by and a relief to avoid, things like Disintegrate. The damage is a lot more swingy as a result. If the area of effect provides no save, it is probably some sort of aura effect, or the effect of a primordial concept like a Marut. After you determine the type of saving throw and the type of damage it deals, we can determine how many areas of effect we have per round, how many people we hit on average, and the chance to save. I would recommend 1 to 2 areas of effect per turn, as to not bog down each round too much and to make each save more impactful. Then we consider the average number of players hit by an AoE. Be realistic about your estimate by factoring the size of the AoE and the likely positioning of your monster. The higher your estimate, the more your AoE will feel like a big damage over time effect. The lower your estimate, the more your AoE will feel like a big burst of damage against a few players. You can get bigger bursts of damage by picking a number between 1 and 2, but be careful about getting too close to 1. That can be a huge spike of damage that can instantly kill a player, not just knock them out. The player's chance to save is very important. If you set the save chance too low, especially at higher levels, it can feel impossible or useless to roll against your creature's effect. I would recommend keeping it at least 45 to 60% at most tiers of play. If your monster is a world-ending beast or a grand super hyper arch wizard, I would get this out of the sweet spot for dramatic effect, and not follow the calculator's DC recommendation. But do this with caution. Now that we've inputted everything we need, we can see our glorious outputs and we're 99% done. We have one last thing to do. Let's build our damage with dice. Every dice has a different average damage and a different feeling to it. D4s are 2.5, sharp as a prick and death by 1,000 cuts flavorfully. A bunch of these are very consistent. D6s and D8s are worth 3.5 and 4.5 average damage respectively. They're in the run-of-the-mill dice tier. Not too consistent, not too swingy. D10s and D12s are 5.5 and 6.5 average damage. They're the big, meaty dice and are a lot more swingy or inconsistent than the rest. D20s are 10.5. They are not typically used for damage dice and are vastly more swingy than the other damage dice, but they are an option if you want something more bombastic. The bigger the damage dice, the more flashy it may be. Your damage per attack number should be composed of any number of any combination of these dice and a static modifier, say +5, as long as it adds up to the damage per attack number. Let's say our damage per attack is 12. It could be 44 plus 2, that's 12 damage, or 2d10 plus 1, that's also 12 damage. If you want each attack to do a different amount of damage like a dragon's multi-attack, simply subtract the damage dice or modifiers from one attack and add any combination of dice and modifiers to another attack. And that's it! We have our monster! Now you know how to use the Homebrew Monster Maker and have a strong understanding of many of the game's underlying design conventions. With this knowledge, you can effectively give your creatures the stats you need for precisely any type of fight rather than shooting in the dark. I've left several links in the description if you want to learn more about the math of the game from a more player side of things. Thanks for watching! This has been my densest video by far, but one of the most important videos I've made. If you've enjoyed the video, leave a like, drop a comment about what you made using the Monster Maker, and subscribe! Thanks so much for the 5K subs, guys.